I'm out here at Samcheong-dong, a historic location within Seoul that has now become a popular destination. Because of the high density of hanoks, or traditional Korean houses, it's a hotspot among locals and foreigners alike. But due to the skyrocketing rent prices, local residents have been forced to move out, a phenomena known as gentrification. So let's now move into a studio within Samcheong-dong to further talk about this issue. Gentrification has become a buzzword in South Korean media in recent years. It refers to a phenomena that's commonly witnessed in neighborhoods that have come into prominence due to its exposure on television and social media. So have you ever personally experienced or witnessed this phenomenon during your stay in South Korea?
Well, I actually live in the Gyeongridan area, so that's a clear example, I think, of neighborhood actually has gone through a peak. Let's say 2, 3, 4 years ago, it was bustling, and now all of a sudden you see all these businesses, especially businesses, right, that have just disappeared.
Or for example, in the Jongno area,
yeah.
It's surrounded by a lot of old workshops. You have literally a feeling of working class Korea from the 60s, 70s, and now it's becoming hip with really nice bars and rooftop things and cultural exhibitions. So yeah, it's exciting, but of course negative sides too. Yeah.
Sure. So gentrification not being just present in South Korea but around the world. Kelly, could you tell us about the experience in the U.S.?
You know, in the U.S. we talk about gentrification a little differently than in Korea. I think in Korea the hot topic is always commercial gentrification. In the U.S. it's often talked about in terms of social class and race. So historically in the United States there was a period of time where everyone's dream was like the white picket fence in the suburbs. And we kind of saw an urban renewal in the last few decades in the US where cities are no longer these grungy, scary places that your kids should stay away from, but actually like a hip cultural center to live in. And this, over time has attracted, businesses, people of higher social classes. There's also just downright racist policies in American history where they've tried to zone Black people or Asian people out of certain areas, and software companies cleaning out a city and making the rents unaffordable, as well as building these luxury housing complexes that are mostly empty and refusing to build low-income housing. So it's also a very big social, political issue in the United States.
Okay, so more to do with demographics in the United States.
Yes.
Fabian, there was an anti-gentrification protest recently in Berlin. Could you tell us more about that?
But I mean, Berlin has a very long history of anti-gentrification protests. That the city just looks as it does today, I think we owe that to the student movement who legally occupied many houses, because in the 70s many real estate speculators left their really old historic houses in ruins until they could demolish them and then build new luxury apartments. And especially from the left, many young people said the city belongs to us, to the public. So now in those districts who are now victim of gentrification, because they have a lot of beautiful historic buildings that were preserved because people protested. Rents have doubled in the last 5 or 6 years for most of the people, and the protests remained relatively peaceful, but there were more than 10,000 people demonstrating against rising rents.
Okay, so more than 10,000 people, that's quite a large protest. What was the government's reaction?
Well, of course, they had a lot of police stationed there, and thank God it remained relatively peaceful. But I mean, the government, they get the problem. Of course, we have a free market, but the government wants to regulate the real estate market because it's happening too fast. In Berlin was actually very attractive because it was affordable, so it attracted a lot of artists, students. You could live without having a corporate job. You could get by in Berlin. That's no longer the case. So now actually Berlin becomes very generic, like Paris, like London. It still has some of its charm, but it's definitely like a relatively expensive metropolis.
So it's lost some of unique characteristics.
I would say so, yeah.
Not all view gentrification in a bad light. So some view it in a positive light because it can revive dilapidated districts. But more people view it in a negative light because it leads to skyrocketing rental prices and also the price of real estate for tenants. What's your overall view on gentrification?
I think the first phase is, as you pointed out, I think it's a positive thing. I mean, you're literally revitalizing area that was uninvested. I think artists, for example, students, people trying to live in affordable places is always a good thing. And, you know, we come from cities and countries where, you know, population is decreasing and, you know, it's a good way, I think, of bringing life to neighborhoods that were waning.
Right.
Well, but I mean, now we live in a global world, so it's not only, let's say, people from within Germany move to Berlin because they like the city, but also you have a lot of investors from China or from Russia who like buy up whole areas and they use it as basically as a summer apartment, or basically don't really live there. So the city in some areas is not really for the people anymore because it becomes, or like apartment blocks being rented out for Airbnb. So I think we should, as a society, pose the question, in what kind of city do we want to live, and what is actually public and what is not. I mean, of course, we live in a capitalist society, and the market regulates demand and offer, but some public goods, I think, should be protected to some degree by the state.
Kelly, what's your take? Do you think it's an unavoidable issue, something that goes along with urban development, or do you think we need to address gentrification?
I think it's something that absolutely can be addressed, and I think a lot of people get bogged up in kind of hiding behind the concept of supply and demand, or you know, that this is just free market capitalism, this is the forces of nature, and we're just supposed to stand by and watch like scientists. And I think there are plenty of interventions, like they both mentioned, that cities should, you know, participate in. We do have to think about what kind of city do we want, what kind of diversity do we want, economic and cultural, business diversity, and we have to set those values as individual cities and strive to reach them, as opposed to saying, you know, like Amazon opened up here and like now we have a lot of software people and that's just the way it is, you know.
Okay, so take a more proactive approach to addressing the problem. Now, the term gentrification, it was first coined by a British sociologist, Ruth Glass, in 1964. So while it's not an entirely new phenomenon, it's not an entirely new concept by any means, the speed at which it takes place has noticeably accelerated compared to half a century ago. Why do you think that is, that the speed of gentrification is happening at a faster rate?
Well, I think it has several reasons. One I mentioned earlier is that global speculators also compete in the real estate market, so you have a lot of more income and influx of foreign capital and foreign people, which is per se, like, I view it neutral. It has good and bad effects, and also social media. So, for example, in Korea is a good example. If some area becomes hip, it's a matter of weeks. Like I still remember in Haebangchon, that's let's say 500 meters away from Itaewon, also kind of the foreign neighborhood, there was one pizza shop that I assume some food blogger must have written a review on it, or maybe it was on TV, and like literally the next day like there was a huge queue on it, and that lasted even until today, and that's really, really fast. I think those like social trends can spread and go viral really, really faster.
I think actually it couples perfectly with social networks kind of behaviors, kind of like hyper-consumerism trends that we're seeing that have just gotten stronger with the use of phones, with the use of social media, Instagram. I mean, we're trying to like force people to consume lifestyles. And that's the thing. You're consuming neighborhoods. You're consuming a city like if it was a natural resource. And of course, also you pointed it out, foreign capitals. Cities are trying to be more and more competitive to attract these capitals. So I think that's some of the reasons, definitely. But I think it's a very complex issue.
Hongdae, Samcheongdong, and Seochon, they've undergone fast gentrification in recent years because they do have that reputation as being an artsy, hip place for young people and tourists alike. The rate of rent increase in those areas have noticeably outpaced those of other neighborhoods around the city. And this has created a lot of friction between landlords and tenants, with property owners trying to capitalize on the opportunity by introducing rent hikes in neighborhoods that are surging in popularity. Shouldn't landlords be allowed to raise rent prices?
I think we haven't used a word so far, and I think it has to be said, and the word is greed. I believe landlords, yes, they do bear a responsibility. You don't just own a piece of land. Like, you know, this piece of land is in a neighborhood. It's connected to a network of people living here. So it's important what you do with that space. And of course, market rules should apply, but...
Landlords, they're living in a capitalistic society and they're not running a charity.
Yeah.
Even if they raise the price, someone is going to come in. Should they be blamed?
I mean, here's the thing. What we're seeing here, the last step of gentrification is literally franchises taking up the space. And this is, you know, this is neighborhoods. People live in them. And we're literally selling off, ultimately, spaces to big companies. So, you know, they're literally occupying public space, ultimately.
You know, anecdotally speaking, I know people who have both been a landlord as well as gotten rich off of being a landlord. My father used to be a landlord. And you know, I think there's a difference between the right to make a profit and the right to become a millionaire. You know, I remember I have a friend who's very wealthy. I'm talking like Italian fountains in the garden wealthy. And we had a conversation about what her parents do. And she just basically said, you know, my father bought all these apartments around a university and remodeled them and jacked up the price. And that is the definition of greed, right? And so that's the difference that we're talking about. You know, a 10% increase, sure. A 650% increase, now we're starting to get a little bit crazy. And I know being a landlord can be very difficult, but there needs to be some kind of intervention from the government, or this is gonna spiral out of control like we're seeing in other countries. You know, in Korea, gentrification is kind of a budding subject. In places like the United States, that conversation has been for 20 or 30 years, and now it's to the point where it's driving people to homelessness, where houses are $600, $700, $1,000 above the fair market rate, and there's no control over that. And so I think Seoul really needs to think about what do they want to prevent from happening in 10 years, because it could very much become a crisis.
Right. So far we've talked about businesses affecting or causing gentrification, but business isn't the only sector that's affecting it. It can also be triggered by government-led redevelopment projects and urban renewal efforts. For example, the Moon Jae-in government announced its Urban Renewal New Deal policy soon after coming into power. It's a huge project worth 50 trillion won, or roughly $42 billion, which will be invested to redevelop 500 designated areas nationwide over 5 years.
전국 170여 곳의 구도심 지역은 도시재생 뉴딜 사업을 통해 새롭게 태어날 것입니다.
Experts are concerned that the government's massive urban renewal project could result in gentrification in the targeted areas. Have there been any noticeable large-scale urban redevelopment projects back in the States?
Yeah, in the United States, I'm from Boston area. There was something called the Big Dig. It was the most expensive highway project in the United States. And part of that was to correct an issue because in the 50s, they built this giant artery highway that cuts through the middle of the city. Everybody thought that was a great idea, right? Because now you can access downtown much easier without going through all these historic old streets because, Boston's one of the oldest cities in America. The byproduct of that was that it, displaced 600 families in Chinatown, which is downtown. So you're talking about 600 families. I mean, that's potentially 1,800 plus people. And it reduced that area so much that now it's, it pales in comparison to what it was. So that's an example of something that, had good intentions, having a really bad effect on a community that lasted for decades after, if that makes sense.
What about in Germany?
I think the most interesting project that I could recall is in Berlin. There's an airport called Tempelhof. It's really in the middle of the city, historically, because West Berlin was kind of a peninsula. It was circled by the Berlin Wall, so they kept one airport in the city. Around 10 years ago, it closed, and suddenly there was like a space of 143 hectares of land just, uninhabited. It was basically like a big garden, and the public used it for, let's say, barbecues or for taking your dog for a walk. But of course, the municipal government, they wanted to create some new housing, and Berlin desperately needs new housing, but rather luxury projects, and that caused so much outcry by the public. So they didn't even want to compromise. For example, one half goes to new buildings, and the other half is left for the public as a recreational space. No, but the protest was so strong, so there was a vote and a petition, and in the end, the whole redevelopment project was scrapped.
Oh, okay. All right. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the most common form of gentrification involves the displacement of native residents due to hiking rent costs. However, there are also cases where residents leave due to inconveniences caused by a rising number of tourists, a phenomenon which has been dubbed touristification. In Barcelona, in Spain, it's one of the world's most popular tourist destinations, but some residents got so angry over the massive number of inbound travelers that an anti-tourism protest broke out in 2017. Tourists generate huge income for the local residents. Do you think they should learn to better tolerate the inconveniences of these influx of tourists?
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, if you think Barcelona is a 1.6 million city and it literally receives 20 million foreigners a year, plus 10 million the Spaniards that also visit the city. That's a lot. Yeah. It's a lot to take. Problem here, of course, protests. Some tourists actually felt a little scared. Nothing happened, of course. But I think the problem is that the focus should not be the tourists here. It's the public governments that actually didn't take care of this problem.
They didn't step in at the
right time. And the problem here is basically Spain is the third most visited country. So you've got touristification up and down, left and right. It's everywhere. And the problem here is that services like Airbnb are working. This has just increased a problem where, you and another apartment in the whole block were the only real people living there, real neighbors. The rest was all tourist apartments. So you come in after a day's work and you have, 20 units taken by tourists, many of them partying hard, heavy drinking. Of course, who likes that, right?
I do actually. Really, I'm serious now. You need those regulations, yeah. But I feel tourists not only bring money to the city, but also cultural exchange. I love it in Berlin, especially in the summer. You go out in some areas, you meet people from Spain, from the US, from France, from all over the world.
The world
have a beer
comes
with
to
them.
you.
Yeah, right. And I think it's an honor. People like the city so much that they spend their money to spend their holidays.
I totally agree, but here's the thing. Nobody's against the tourism. I mean, the idea of what tourism brings to cities in Spain. I mean, GDP in Spain, 11% of GDP depends on tourism. It's the country that is most dependent in the world on tourism. We perfectly know that. The problem with Airbnb models, this massified tourism model is like, who is it benefiting? Of course, culturally, yeah, there's exchange, But who's taking all the money and the bulk money? And how is this money reinvested in communities, in neighborhoods? I mean, we're talking about investment funds buying whole blocks in Barcelona and Madrid and turning them into tourist apartments. They're not reinvesting any of that money into the neighborhoods, right? So now you have projects that are interesting. There's going to be a new platform that is going to launch this year. It has Vienna, it has Amsterdam, it has Barcelona. It's called Airbnb.
Okay.
And these people are planning to, like, the 50% of the service charge that they take from people that rent the apartments is gonna go to neighborhood projects to reinvest. I think that's the kind of thing that makes it more sustainable, definitely.
And I think also to the point that you mentioned before, it's not the tourism per se that they're against it, but the level of tourism, the massive level of tourism. All right, let's shift gears now and talk about possible ways to counter the negative effects of gentrification. So in Seoul, back in 2016, the Seoul metropolitan government introduced a blanket ban on franchise businesses from opening up shop in the popular Seochon district. Do you think this was a reasonable decision or a heavy-handed intervention?
I think it was perfectly reasonable. I think that the government, in several countries really does need to make interventions like this. And honestly, it's hard to have sympathy for a franchise because, quite frankly, they have enough money. And you see how franchises in different parts of Korea have really affected neighborhoods. Gwanghwamun has, I think, the highest concentration of Starbucks in the area. There's literally so many on every single block corner. And the effect of that, this is a major business district, all of the newspapers are in that area, plenty of government buildings, is that, you gotta walk a while to be able to find lunch, and a good lunch, right? And I think that, we forget how the character of neighborhoods can change for the worse when we have these kind of franchise factories kind of building everywhere. And so, I'm for it. If they were trying to, regulate a franchise that has 4 locations, maybe I'd care, but it's fine if there's no KFC or no more KFCs in that area. Yeah.
Do you guys agree as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's limited to some areas. And for example, when you mentioned Seochon, those are really like iconic areas for the collective memory or collective consciousness of Koreans. It basically endangers also the identity and also the attraction of tourists if you have those key iconic areas basically ending up very generic. Then you cannot really differentiate anymore. Okay, am I in Hong Kong now? Am I in Seoul or in New York? Because that's the franchise thing, right? You have Starbucks everywhere, you have McDonald's everywhere. But what is actually really unique about Korea and Seoul? Yeah, and so I think you protect those areas.
I think it's totally reasonable. I mean, iconic areas should totally be protected from this kind of phenomenon, franchises, because in the end, you're killing it. And I think, in my opinion, this has to do with sustainability. You want these areas to grow in a sustainable way, sustained in time. Of course, this goes against the idea of speculating on short-term, right? But if you do protect these areas, you're guaranteeing in them a survival. They will attract tourism on a sustained way. They will attract people from other neighborhoods in a sustained way because you still have the experience and the charm of the place. If you start just franchising every single place, you're just killing the feeling, the atmosphere. Totally. You're making it generic. You use the word.
One interesting thing to add is that I have noticed that franchises are probably aware of this criticism and they do adapt sometimes for the area that they're in, which I find interesting. So in Insadong, like a lot of the major chains will like change their title to Korean to somehow be like cooler, like you see Dunkin' Donuts written in Korean. In Boston, we have major historical buildings that have turned into Chipotle and Starbucks. And so what they do is they like kind of create like a distressed looking old sign, like it's also from the 1800s. And they get by like that. And we have to ask the greater question of, is that enough? I mean, just aesthetically, is that all we're trying to protect? Or are we also trying to protect small businesses and like the true character of an area? Because, you know, once again, it can become kind of like Disneyland if we keep letting all these franchises come in.
Yeah, because in many cases it's about protecting the livelihoods of these people in those areas. All right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, some pundits say that gentrification is an inevitable growing pain of urban renewal. But we should always keep in mind that the beating heart that keeps any region alive is not money or capital, but rather the people living within them. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.